The courtroom was silent, except for the steady tapping of the judge's gavel. In front of him stood Marcus Johnson, a tall, confident black man, wearing a sharp black suit. His eyes were calm, but his heart raced. He was no ordinary man. In fact, he was the director of the FBI, the highest position a law enforcement officer could hold in the United States. Yet, in this moment, he stood accused by a judge who did not know his true identity. The judge, Judge Randall Graves, was a man who held strong biases against people who didn't look like him. He had a reputation for being stern and unforgiving, especially to those he believed didn't belong in certain circles. His voice echoed through the courtroom as he spoke, his words dripping with disdain. Marcus Johnson, Judge Graves sneered, his eyes narrowing at the defendant. You are nothing more than a fraud. A charlatan, playing dress-up, trying to deceive this court into thinking you have any real value. You don't belong here. You don't even belong in this country. A murmur spread through the courtroom, but Marcus stood still, his face unreadable. The judge's words stung, but Marcus wasn't going to let this man see how much they hurt. He had a bigger game to play. He was used to being underestimated, to being judged by the color of his skin, to people assuming he wasn't capable of great things. But Marcus had proven them all wrong. He had risen through the ranks, defied expectations, and earned his place as the leader of the FBI. But this moment was different. This was no ordinary day in court. The stakes were high. His reputation, his career, and his life were all on the line. And here he was, standing before a man who had no idea who he truly was. A man who had no idea that Marcus had the power to change the course of history with a single phone call. Your Honor, Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but powerful. I don't think you understand who you're speaking to. Judge Graves chuckled, clearly amused by the boldness of the man before him. Oh, I understand perfectly well. You think you can fool me, but I've seen men like you come and go. You're no different. But Marcus wasn't going to let this slide. Not today. Not after everything he had worked for. He straightened his back and looked the judge directly in the eye. What you don't know, Marcus said, his voice rising, is that I hold the highest position in the FBI. I am the director. You are in my world now, not the other way around. The room fell deathly silent. The judge's face turned pale, his arrogant expression faltering as the weight of Marcus's words hit him like a ton of bricks. But just as quickly, the judge regained his composure. Nice try, he muttered, trying to laugh off the shock. But I don't buy it. You're just a fraud. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft rustling of papers. Marcus had expected some form of resistance, but not this level of ignorance. It was as though the judge had closed his mind off to the truth, unable to comprehend the reality of the situation. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. You really don't believe me, do you? Well, let me tell you something. I can end this whole thing with one phone call. Do you understand? One call, and your entire career could be over. The judge's eyes widened, but before he could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. The courtroom door opened, and a man in a suit stepped in, holding a sealed envelope. He walked swiftly toward the judge, handing him the envelope without saying a word. The judge tore open the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He scanned the contents of the letter, his eyes widening as he read. A look of disbelief spread across his face, but before he could react, the man in the suit spoke. Sir, the information in this letter is confirmed. Marcus Johnson is indeed the director of the FBI. Judge Graves' face went ashen. He looked at Marcus, his expression now a mix of fear and regret. Marcus just stared back, unblinking. What do you want from me? The judge stammered, his arrogance now completely gone. Marcus smiled. I want nothing from you, Your Honor. But I'm about to make sure you understand that you never mess with the wrong person again. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. The power had shifted. Marcus had the upper hand now. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence, the tension thick in the air. But just as it seemed like Marcus had won, something unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom slammed open, and several armed men in black suits stormed in, their guns drawn. They moved quickly, surrounding Marcus with military precision. The room erupted in chaos as the judge's previous arrogance transformed into confusion. The armed men weren't here for him. They were here for Marcus, the man who was supposed to be untouchable. The scene had shifted again. Marcus was no longer in control. This was no longer a simple case of proving who he was. The game had just escalated, and now, Marcus was on the receiving end of a much larger threat than he had ever anticipated. As the men moved toward him, Marcus's mind raced. He had no idea who these people were, but they weren't here for any ordinary reason. Someone powerful had orchestrated this, someone who wanted him gone, by any means necessary. "Move!" one of the armed men shouted, his voice cold and commanding. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a gunshot. The courtroom descended into a frenzy as people screamed and tried to flee, but Marcus was already in motion. His FBI training kicked in as he assessed the situation. He couldn't let them take him. Not now. Not after everything he had worked for. He had to fight back. But just as he started to make his move, the unthinkable happened. Judge Graves, who had moments before been in the spotlight for his racist remarks, suddenly grabbed a hidden firearm from beneath the bench and aimed it at Marcus. The judge's finger twitched on the trigger, and everything went black. The beginning of Marcus's journey had just taken a shocking turn, but it was only the beginning. When Marcus regained consciousness, everything felt wrong. His head throbbed, and his body ached as if he had been hit by a truck. The dim light above him flickered, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar room. His vision was blurry, but he could make out the shape of a metal chair in front of him. He blinked, trying to clear his mind, but his hands were bound tightly to the arms of the chair. His heart raced as panic began to set in. Where was he? For a moment, he thought the whole thing had been a nightmare, but the cold steel around his wrists reminded him that this was real. He took a deep breath, his FBI training kicking in. Focus. Analyze the situation. There was no time to waste. The last thing he remembered was Judge Graves pointing a gun at him. But how had he gotten here? Had the judge fired? Was he injured? He felt his body. Nothing seemed broken, but there was a sharp pain in his side. He hadn't imagined it. He had been shot. His mind raced. Who had saved him? And who were those men who stormed into the courtroom? A door creaked open behind him, and Marcus's muscles tensed. He didn't have to wait long before he heard footsteps approaching. He couldn't let them see him unprepared. Slowly, he shifted in the chair, trying to loosen his bonds without making a sound. The footsteps stopped, and a deep voice broke the silence. Well, look who's awake." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't recognize the voice, but the tone sent a message loud and clear. This wasn't going to be easy. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice stronger than he felt. "What do you want from me?" A man in a black suit stepped into his line of sight. He had an intimidating presence, tall with a stern face. The man smirked as he looked Marcus up and down, his eyes calculating. "You really don't know who I am?" the man asked, as though he found Marcus's question amusing. "I'm disappointed, Director Johnson." Marcus's stomach turned. The man knew who he was. There was no doubt about that now. But who was he, and why was he doing this? "Why am I here?" Marcus repeated, his voice sharper this time. "What do you want?" The man walked slowly around him, as if inspecting him, his footsteps echoing in the small, concrete room. "You have something we want, and you're going to help us get it." Marcus frowned, confusion clouding his mind. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have anything you want." The man stopped behind him and leaned in close. His breath was cold against Marcus's ear as he whispered, "Oh, you have something. You just don't realize it yet." The hairs on the back of Marcus's neck stood up. What was this man talking about? His mind raced, searching for anything that might give him a clue, but nothing made sense. He had to stay calm. He needed to think. Before he could ask another question, a second man entered the room. This one was smaller, but no less dangerous. He carried an air of authority, his sharp eyes focused on Marcus. Without saying a word, the new arrival stepped forward and grabbed Marcus's head, forcing it back. Marcus winced in pain as the man pressed something cold against his neck. "A syringe." "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice low, trying to remain steady. "It's for your own good," the first man replied. "Just a little something to help you relax." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had heard enough about what powerful enemies could do when they wanted information. This was how it all started. The intimidation, the threats, the torture. He had to think fast. Marcus clenched his fists, trying to break free from the bonds that held him. He needed to get out of here. His mind raced through possibilities, but every escape route seemed to be blocked. Still, he wouldn't give up. Not without a fight. As the man with the syringe leaned in, Marcus took a deep breath and, using every ounce of strength, twisted his body violently to the side. It was a desperate move, but it worked. The man lost his balance and stumbled back, giving Marcus just enough time to break free from his restraints. With a quick twist, he threw himself out of the chair and landed hard on the floor, rolling into a crouch. The men were momentarily stunned, but Marcus didn't waste time. He sprinted toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as his fingers brushed the cold metal handle, the door burst open and another figure appeared. A tall woman, dressed in tactical gear, stood there, blocking his escape. "Not so fast," she said, her voice calm but firm. Marcus froze, his mind racing. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. He had to make a decision. Fight, or try to reason his way out of this mess. Before he could decide, the man with the syringe, now recovered from his stumble, grabbed him from behind, locking Marcus's arms in a tight hold. The woman stepped forward, and this time, her expression was all business. "You're not going anywhere, Director Johnson," she said coldly. Marcus struggled, but the man's grip was unbreakable. His adrenaline surged, but he knew there was no point in wasting his energy. They were in control now. The odds were against him, but there was still one thing Marcus knew. He wasn't going down without a fight. But just as it seemed like the situation was hopeless, something strange happened. The woman's calm demeanor shifted, and her gaze flicked to something behind Marcus. She froze, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on?" the man holding Marcus demanded. Before anyone could respond, the walls of the small room seemed to shake, and a loud, deafening crash echoed through the air. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as the sound of gunfire followed. The woman's expression turned from shock to pure panic, and in that split second, Marcus knew this was his chance. He twisted out of the man's grip and ducked low, rolling toward the nearest wall for cover. As he glanced around, he saw the woman and the man struggling to regain their composure. The gunfire continued, but the direction of the shots was unclear. It was like someone was trying to break in, someone who didn't want Marcus to be taken. The door to the room burst open again, and this time, Marcus didn't hesitate. He dashed toward the exit, adrenaline fueling his every move. As he stepped out into the hallway, the chaos was overwhelming. He could see several armed men moving down the corridor, guns raised. But there was no time to worry about them. Marcus had to find a way out, and fast. The gunfire was getting louder. It was clear that whoever was causing this ruckus wanted Marcus alive. The question was, why? But one thing was for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. And just as he rounded the corner, a familiar voice crackled through his earpiece. "Marcus, we've got your back." It was his team. Finally, the cavalry had arrived. But the battle was far from over. Marcus's heart raced, but for the first time since waking up in that cold, unfamiliar room, he felt a flicker of hope. His team was here. He could hear the crackling of his earpiece as his team leader, Agent Rachel Davis, spoke again, her voice steady and calm despite the chaos. "Stay low, Marcus. We're moving in. Get to the extraction point." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted down the narrow hallway, keeping his back pressed to the wall as he ducked and weaved through the maze of corridors. Every step felt like it could be his last. The sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance, but he kept his focus. His FBI team was coming, and he had to make it to them. As he rounded a corner, he saw the group of men in black suits coming toward him, weapons raised. They weren't part of his team. They weren't here to help. Marcus took a deep breath, his training kicking in once again. He crouched down, taking cover behind a large metal pillar. The men were closing in, unaware of his position. He only had a few seconds to act, and he knew exactly what he had to do. With lightning speed, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his gun, the cold steel a comfort in his hand. He had been in situations like this before. Dangerous, high-stakes operations where every move could mean the difference between life and death. The first man rounded the corner, and Marcus fired. The shot rang out, sharp and precise, hitting the man in the shoulder. He stumbled back in pain, his weapon clattering to the floor. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, taking cover behind a nearby barrel and using his position to reload. He could hear the other men shouting, their voices filled with anger and confusion. They knew they were being hunted, and Marcus wasn't about to let them get away. One by one, he picked them off, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The last man fell to the ground, his weapon skidding across the floor. Marcus didn't pause to savor the victory. He had no time for that. He had to keep moving. His earpiece crackled again. "Marcus, we're almost there. Hold tight." "Copy that," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." He moved quickly, pushing through the hallway and towards the extraction point. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. Who were these people? Why had they attacked him in the courtroom? And why had they been so eager to capture him? His thoughts were interrupted as he rounded another corner and came face to face with a locked door. It was a heavy metal door, and there was no time to waste trying to pick the lock. But Marcus had dealt with worse. He pulled out a small explosive charge from his pocket, carefully setting it on the door. "Move back," he muttered to himself, stepping away just as the charge went off with a deafening bang. The door blew open, sending debris flying. Marcus quickly darted through the opening, gun raised and ready for whatever lay beyond. The room he entered was dimly lit, with rows of computer terminals lining the walls. It looked like some kind of operations center, but there was no time to admire the space. Marcus knew the extraction point was close. His team was waiting, and they needed to leave before reinforcements showed up. He didn't see anyone in the room, but the low hum of machinery made it clear that this place was still operational. A few seconds later, the door to the room slammed open, and several armed men in tactical gear rushed in. They were too late. Marcus fired first, his movements quick and precise. One man dropped immediately, his body crumpling to the ground. Another took cover behind a terminal, but Marcus was faster. He moved toward him, dodging bullets, and took the man out with a single shot to the chest. The remaining men hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But Marcus didn't give them the chance. He was already moving, his eyes scanning the room for any other threats. But before he could reach the exit, a loud voice echoed through his earpiece. "Marcus, get out now. We're running out of time." It was Rachel again, her voice urgent. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Something had changed. He knew that tone. They were in danger. Without thinking, he bolted for the exit, pushing through the door and back into the hallway. His feet pounded against the floor as he ran, the sound of his breath loud in his ears. He could hear the faint sounds of footsteps behind him, more armed men, closing in on his position. He reached a corner and paused for just a second, glancing over his shoulder. The men were right behind him, and they were getting closer. "Almost there," Marcus muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his pounding heart. He rounded the next corner and saw his team. They were waiting for him, guns drawn, ready to protect him. Rachel gave him a sharp nod. "We need to move. Now." But just as Marcus was about to sprint toward her, the ground beneath him trembled, and the entire building shook. The lights flickered, and a loud rumble filled the air. It felt like an earthquake, but it was far too controlled to be natural. Something was happening. Something big. Before he could react, the floor buckled beneath him, and Marcus was thrown to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and everything went dark for a moment. When he came to, he was still on the floor, but now the sound of gunfire was deafening. There were shouts, screams, and explosions. The entire building seemed to be falling apart around him. The walls cracked, and pieces of concrete rained down from above. "Marcus!" Rachel's voice rang out, barely audible over the chaos. "We have to go. Now." Marcus struggled to his feet, his body aching from the fall. His head was spinning, and his vision was blurry. But he couldn't let this stop him. His team needed him. He had to get them out of here. With Rachel leading the way, Marcus and the rest of the team made a mad dash toward the exit. But the building was collapsing faster than they could move. The ground beneath them cracked open, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending debris tumbling toward them. They barely made it out in time, the last of the debris missing them by mere inches. Marcus didn't stop. He ran harder than he ever had before, pushing himself and his team forward. But even as they neared the exit, something in his gut told him this was only the beginning. Someone powerful was behind all of this, and they weren't done with him yet. As they burst through the exit, Marcus looked up at the night sky. He had escaped, but only just. His mind was racing. Who was behind all this? And why had they attacked him? The answers were out there, and Marcus was determined to find them, no matter the cost. The night air was cool against Marcus's skin as he and his team sprinted toward their extraction point, a black SUV waiting for them. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed from behind them as the building continued to collapse in on itself. But they couldn't afford to look back. They had to keep moving forward. The SUV's engine roared to life as Rachel slid into the driver's seat, her face a mask of focus. The others quickly followed suit, taking their positions. Marcus was the last to get in, slamming the door shut just as a wave of dust and debris blew toward them from the crumbling structure behind them. Go, go, go! Marcus shouted as Rachel floored the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, speeding down the narrow alleyway that led to the main road. The tires screeched as they hit the pavement, but they didn't slow down. The sound of their escape was drowned out by the cacophony of chaos behind them. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to process what had just happened. They had barely made it out alive. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was pulling the strings behind the attack. But who? And why? Rachel, what's going on? Marcus asked, his voice tense. Who was behind this? And why were they after me? Rachel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. I don't know, Marcus. We've been trying to figure it out since you were taken. But whoever these people are, they're well-funded and well-connected. They had plans in place to take you out, and they almost succeeded. The car swerved sharply as a black SUV appeared behind them, chasing them down the road at high speed. Marcus's pulse quickened as he glanced over his shoulder. We've got company, he said, his voice low. Get us out of here. Rachel slammed her foot on the gas, pushing the SUV to its limits. The engine roared as they sped down the winding streets, narrowly avoiding traffic. The pursuing vehicle was close behind them, and Marcus could hear the faint sound of gunfire as the other SUV tried to get a clear shot. We need to shake them, Marcus said, his mind racing. He knew they didn't have much time before the other vehicle caught up. Rachel swerved sharply, taking a hard left turn at full speed, sending the SUV skidding dangerously across the road. The tires screeched as they barely avoided hitting a lamppost. The pursuing SUV followed, but it wasn't able to make the turn as cleanly. The sound of metal scraping against the sidewalk filled the air as it crashed into the side of the street. For a moment, Marcus thought they had lost them. But just as he was about to relax, a blinding flash of light erupted from behind them, followed by the sound of an explosion. The shockwave rocked the SUV, sending them careening to the side. The explosion had been close. Too close. Rachel, get us off the road, Marcus yelled, gripping the seat as the vehicle slid out of control. Rachel fought to regain control of the wheel, but the SUV's momentum was too much. They slid down the street and collided with a stack of barrels on the side of the road, throwing the vehicle to a halt. The impact knocked Marcus against the side of the car, his head slamming against the window. He winced, but there was no time to recover. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. Get out of the car now, Rachel barked, already unbuckling her seatbelt. They're right behind us. Marcus didn't hesitate. He was out of the SUV in seconds, crouching low as he scanned the area. His team was already in motion, their weapons drawn and ready. They had trained for moments like this, moments when they had to think fast and adapt to the unexpected. Move, Marcus commanded, signaling to his team to head toward the alley ahead. They couldn't afford to stay in the open. The enemy was closing in, and they had no idea how many were out there. They ducked into the alley, the sound of heavy boots echoing in the distance. Marcus's mind raced as they moved through the darkened streets. Who was behind this attack? Why did they want him? But there was no time for answers. Not yet. As they reached the end of the alley, Marcus heard a noise, a low hum, like the sound of an engine. He looked up to see another black SUV pulling up to the intersection ahead. The men inside the vehicle were heavily armed, their weapons at the ready. They were trapped. Split up, Marcus ordered. We'll make it harder for them to track us. His team didn't question him. They knew what to do. They scattered in different directions, disappearing into the shadows. Marcus moved quickly, his every step calculated as he sprinted toward a nearby building. He reached the door just as he heard the first shots ring out from behind him. He dove through the entrance, slamming the door behind him. The room he found himself in was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. He paused, catching his breath, trying to assess the situation. He couldn't stay here for long. The enemy was closing in, and he couldn't afford to be caught in a corner. He turned around to find himself in what appeared to be a storage area, boxes stacked high against the walls. There were no windows, and the only exit was the door he had just come through. His fingers brushed the handle of a nearby broom, and an idea sparked in his mind. It wasn't much, but it could buy him the time he needed. He quickly set to work, knocking over boxes to create a makeshift barricade in front of the door. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall outside. The men were getting closer. Marcus's heart pounded as he moved toward the back of the room. He had no idea where the rest of his team was, or if they were even still alive. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, keep fighting. He couldn't let them win. Not now. Not after everything. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a voice he recognized. Marcus, Rachel's voice came through his earpiece, barely audible over the static. "We've got a problem." "What is it?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. "We've been compromised," Rachel replied, her tone urgent. "Whoever these people are, they've got intel on us. They knew exactly where you were, exactly where to find us. And now we've got a bigger problem. They've captured one of our team members." Marcus's stomach sank. "Who?" "It's Agent Davis. They've got him." Marcus's mind raced. The situation was escalating faster than he had ever anticipated. His team was scattered. One of them was in enemy hands, and the people behind this attack weren't going to stop until they had him too. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He had to find a way to rescue his team. He had to figure out who was pulling the strings. And he had to do it before it was too late. Marcus stood in the dark room, the air thick with tension. His mind was in overdrive as Rachel's words echoed in his ear. Agent Davis had been captured. It wasn't just a blow to their mission. It was a direct threat to everything they had worked for. "Marcus, are you there?" Rachel's voice broke through again, a bit more urgent this time. "We don't have much time. They're not just after you. They want all of us. They've got intel on everything, where we've been, who we've spoken to. This is big. We're compromised." Marcus gritted his teeth. He knew this wasn't just a random attack anymore. Someone had planned this out in great detail. Someone had been tracking their every move. And if they had Agent Davis, that meant they were serious. "Don't worry, Rachel," Marcus said, his voice firm, trying to reassure her. "We're going to get him back. I need you to focus on getting the rest of the team out of here. I'll find Davis." "Roger that," she replied, though Marcus could tell she was still worried. "Be careful, Marcus. They're everywhere." Before he could respond, the earpiece crackled with static. The signal was weakening. He had to move. The longer he stayed here, the higher the risk of being cornered. But as he turned to leave the storage room, a sudden noise froze him in his tracks, a low rumble, like a distant engine. His instincts kicked in, and he dove behind the nearest stack of crates, crouching low to avoid being seen. He listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It was growing louder. Someone was coming. His heart raced as he peered through the small gap between the boxes, watching the shadows shift in the dim light. A moment later, a figure appeared. It was a man, dressed in tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. He moved with the precision of someone who had been trained for situations like this, stealthy, deliberate, and dangerous. Marcus held his breath, waiting for the right moment. The man was moving toward the far side of the room, seemingly unaware of Marcus's presence. This was his chance. In one smooth motion, Marcus sprang from his hiding spot and tackled the man from behind, knocking him to the ground with a thud. The man grunted in pain but quickly reached for his weapon. Marcus was faster. He disarmed him with a swift twist, sending the gun skittering across the floor. The man glared up at Marcus, his eyes full of hatred. "You're making a big mistake," he spat. Marcus leaned down, grabbing him by the collar. "Where's Agent Davis?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. The man didn't respond at first, but Marcus tightened his grip, pushing him against the cold concrete wall. "I won't ask again. Where is he?" The man smirked, blood trickling from his lip. "You think you can save him? You think you're in control here? You're nothing more than a pawn. All of you are." Marcus's patience wore thin. He was done playing games. "I'm not asking for your opinion," he said, his voice cold. "I'm asking for Davis. Tell me, or I'll make you regret it." The man's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're wasting your time," he muttered. "We're everywhere. You can't stop us. You're already too late." Just then, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of gunfire. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Was it his team? Were they under attack again? The man in his grasp smirked once more, sensing Marcus's distraction. "You're not going to make it out of here alive." Marcus wasn't about to let that happen. With a swift move, he knocked the man unconscious, dropping him to the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't have time to waste. Agent Davis was out there, and every second that passed made his chances of rescuing him slimmer. He sprinted toward the exit of the storage room, his mind racing with possibilities. There had to be a way to find Davis, but he knew time was running out. The building was huge, and the enemy had already proven they had eyes everywhere. They were waiting for him. He had to be smart. He moved silently, keeping to the shadows as he navigated through the labyrinth of corridors. The faint sound of voices and footsteps reached his ears. The enemy was close. Too close. Marcus ducked into a small alcove, pressing himself against the cold concrete wall. He listened carefully, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I don't care how many we have to send," a voice said from down the hall. "We get him, and we get Davis. This ends tonight." Marcus's pulse quickened. They were talking about him, about Davis. They were planning something. But what? He risked a glance around the corner and saw two armed men standing guard outside a reinforced door. They were focused on the hallway, unaware of his presence. This was it. This was where they were holding Davis. Marcus's mind raced. He needed a plan. Fast. He scanned the area, looking for anything he could use. His eyes landed on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall next to him. It wasn't much, but it could give him the distraction he needed. He grabbed it, silently pulling it from its mount and hefting it in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself. With one quick, silent move, Marcus hurled the fire extinguisher down the hallway. It clattered loudly on the floor, drawing the attention of the two guards. They immediately moved toward the noise, leaving the door unprotected. This was his chance. Marcus wasted no time. He sprinted down the hallway, reaching the door in seconds. He tried the handle, locked. Of course. He pulled out a small tool from his pocket, a lock-picking kit. His hands worked quickly, his heart pounding as the seconds ticked by. He couldn't afford to get caught. He had to get Davis out, and he had to do it now. The lock clicked open. Marcus wasted no time, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. The room was dark, but he could make out the shape of a man tied to a chair in the center of the room. It was Davis. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, but he was still alive. Marcus moved toward him, cutting the ropes that bound his hands. "Davis, you're okay," Marcus whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're getting out of here." Davis's eyes fluttered open, and he gave a weak nod. "Took you long enough," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Marcus didn't have time for jokes. He grabbed Davis's arm and helped him to his feet, pulling him toward the exit. But as they moved toward the door, they heard footsteps approaching. They were too late. They had been spotted. "Move," Marcus shouted, pushing Davis ahead of him as they ran down the corridor. Behind them, the sound of shouts and running feet grew louder. They were being chased. Marcus's heart raced as he pulled Davis along, knowing the enemy was closing in. There was no time to lose. But as they reached the next corner, Marcus saw a figure standing in front of them. A familiar face. "Marcus," Rachel's voice came through the chaos. "We need to go. Now." But it wasn't over yet. The world seemed to slow for a moment as Marcus, Davis, and Rachel locked eyes across the hallway. Their reunion was brief, but in this moment, it meant everything. Rachel was panting, her clothes torn from their earlier fight, but her expression was a mixture of relief and determination. "We've got to move," Rachel said, her voice low but firm. "They're coming from every direction now. If we don't get out of here, it's over." Marcus nodded quickly, turning his attention back to Davis, who was still trying to regain his bearings. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he looked far worse than Marcus had first thought. His face was bruised, his hands cut and swollen, likely from hours or even days of being tortured. "We don't have time for this, Davis," Marcus said urgently. "We need to get you somewhere safe. You okay to move?" Davis gave him a weak thumbs up. "As long as you're not planning on carrying me the rest of the way." Marcus couldn't help but crack a half-smile at that, but the situation was still dire. The sound of footsteps, heavy and fast, came from both sides of the corridor. They had no more time to waste. "All right, let's go," Marcus said, his voice now sharper, taking charge. He motioned for Rachel to lead the way. They started running again, the echo of their footsteps now accompanied by the frantic pounding of enemies closing in from all directions. As they moved down the narrow hallway, Marcus's mind raced. Where could they go? They had to get out of the building, but it seemed like every exit had been sealed off. The building was a maze, and it was beginning to feel like they were being funneled toward an inescapable trap. Rachel swerved to the left, and Marcus followed closely, keeping Davis moving ahead of him. The sound of pursuit grew louder, and Marcus could feel the heat of the chase on his back. The pressure was mounting, but he couldn't afford to stop or slow down. Not yet. As they reached the next intersection, Marcus saw a door marked with the word exit. A moment of hope flared in his chest. If they could get through there, they could make their way to the back alley where their extraction vehicle was supposed to be waiting. "Over here," Marcus shouted, and they made a sharp turn toward the door. But as they approached, the door swung open abruptly, and two men in tactical gear stepped into the hallway, blocking their path. One of them held a rifle, his eyes steely with resolve. "Not so fast," the man sneered. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. They were trapped. This was it. No more options. Without thinking, Marcus pushed Davis back, shoving him toward Rachel for cover. He couldn't let them take Davis again. He couldn't let them win. The man with the rifle raised his weapon, but Marcus was faster. With a quick movement, Marcus reached for his sidearm, aiming it straight at the man's chest. A single shot rang out, echoing through the hallway. The man dropped, his rifle clattering to the floor. But just as quickly, Marcus turned to see the second man raising his own weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. The moment felt like it was dragging on forever. Marcus couldn't move fast enough. He knew what was coming. The shot would come in seconds. The question was, would it be the last thing he ever heard? But then, a figure appeared behind the second man, moving faster than Marcus could process. In an instant, the man was disarmed, his weapon flying from his hands and landing several feet away. A swift kick to his chest sent him sprawling to the floor. "Move!" Rachel shouted as she grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him forward. It was a blur of motion, and suddenly they were past the two men, running once again toward the exit. Marcus couldn't believe what had just happened. It had all happened so fast. But now wasn't the time to dwell on it. They were still being pursued, and the danger was far from over. They reached the exit door and burst out into the night air. The sound of gunfire echoed from the building behind them, and the sharp smell of smoke and burning debris filled their lungs. Marcus took a deep breath, squinting into the darkness. The alley was empty, but the vehicle they had arranged for extraction should have been waiting just a few yards away. He glanced at Rachel, who was still holding Davis, guiding him along with a determined grip. "We're almost there," Marcus said, his voice steady but urgent. Just a few more steps. But before they could move another inch, the unmistakable sound of an engine revving filled the air. Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. A black SUV was speeding toward them, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "Get down," Marcus yelled, shoving Rachel and Davis out of the way just as the SUV barreled toward them. It screeched to a halt mere inches from where they had been standing, and the door swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression cold and calculating. Marcus felt his pulse race. He had seen this man before. It was the same person who had been in the room with the man who had nearly captured him earlier, one of the people behind this entire operation. "Marcus Johnson," the man said with a smirk. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus tightened his grip on his gun, his mind working fast. The man wasn't alone. The SUV was packed with more armed men, all wearing the same tactical gear. They were outnumbered, and with Davis injured, their chances of survival were slim. "We can do this the easy way," the man continued, taking a slow step toward them. "Or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Marcus could feel the pressure building. If they didn't act fast, this was going to be their last stand. His mind raced, analyzing their options. They were too exposed out in the open. If they stayed here, they were sitting ducks. "Rachel," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "Get Davis to the car. I'll hold them off." Rachel's eyes flicked toward him, hesitation in her gaze. "Marcus, we can't." "Just go," Marcus interrupted. "I'll cover you." "Now." Rachel hesitated for a second longer, but then she nodded, helping Davis into the SUV. As soon as they were safely inside, Marcus turned back to face their attackers. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were smarter than this, Director Johnson. But maybe you're just as foolish as everyone else." Marcus tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're dealing with." With a sudden, fierce movement, Marcus raised his gun and fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. The SUV erupted in chaos as the armed men scrambled to return fire. But Marcus didn't wait for them to recover. He sprinted toward the car, his gun blazing as he shot down one of the men. The others were closing in, and Marcus knew time was running out. He had to make this last shot count. But just as he reached the SUV, another shot rang out, this one much louder. Marcus's world went black. The world spun in a blur of pain and confusion. Marcus felt his body lurch forward as the bullet hit him. A burning sensation tore through his chest, and the world around him seemed to go still for just a moment, like everything had frozen in place. He felt himself lose his footing, his legs giving way beneath him. The sound of gunfire echoed in his ears, distant and muffled. His vision blurred as his body hit the ground hard, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He gasped for air, but each breath seemed to send a wave of agony through his body. "Marcus," Rachel's voice cut through the haze, filled with panic. "No, no, no. Get up." He tried to move, but his body refused to respond. His mind screamed at him to get up, to keep fighting. But all he could do was lie there, the pain radiating from his chest, his body refusing to follow his commands. The sharp sound of another gunshot broke through the fog in his brain, but Marcus couldn't tell where it came from. His head spun, and his limbs felt like they were made of lead. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but everything seemed to swim in and out of focus. "Marcus!" Rachel cried again, her voice closer now. He felt her hands gripping his shoulders, trying to pull him up. Through the haze of pain, Marcus could make out the vague shapes of the men closing in on them. They were advancing, too many of them to handle. His mind raced. They were so close. He had to stay conscious. He had to stay alive. "Get to the car," Marcus rasped, barely able to get the words out. "Get Davis out of here." "No, we're not leaving you." Rachel's voice was frantic now, desperate. She pulled at him, trying to lift him. But Marcus could feel the coldness creeping in, the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. His breathing was ragged, and the world around him seemed to spin faster. Every part of him screamed for air, for life, but the fight was slipping away. Suddenly, a loud crash interrupted the scene. The SUV that they had been trying to reach exploded in a burst of fiery light, the sound deafening, and the shockwave nearly knocked Rachel off her feet. She screamed in shock, pulling back from Marcus as she shielded her face from the blast. The force of the explosion sent everyone scattering. Marcus could barely make out the figures running, some toward the wreckage, others retreating into the shadows. But through the pain, he knew this was their moment. This was his chance to make sure his team survived. A shadowy figure appeared in his blurry vision. He couldn't make out their face, but they were moving swiftly, purposefully. The figure reached out, their hands grabbing Marcus's body and lifting him as if he weighed nothing. He was dragged into cover, the world spinning around him. "Stay with me, Director," the figure said, their voice muffled and distant. "We're almost there." Marcus's mind screamed at him to stay awake. The world around him was a blur, his vision swimming, but his hand instinctively reached out, grasping at whatever he could. His fingers brushed against the rough fabric of a coat. The figure didn't answer, but they moved with purpose, quickly dragging him away from the gunfire, further into the alley. The warmth of the blood, soaking his clothes, was becoming unbearable, and the world around him grew dimmer. Marcus wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious when he woke up again. His head was pounding, and his chest felt tight. But this time, when he opened his eyes, he was no longer outside, no longer in the heat of battle. He was in a dimly lit room. His hands were bandaged, his wounds carefully dressed. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and there was a quiet, almost serene hum in the background. It was too quiet. He slowly sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in his side and chest. His body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and uncooperative. As he moved, a figure appeared by his side, a silhouette in the low light. "Easy," the figure said, their voice calm and steady. "Take it slow." Marcus turned his head, his vision still blurry but slowly clearing. It was the same person who had dragged him to safety, someone he didn't recognize. They had short, dark hair, and their expression was guarded but not unfriendly. "Who are you?" Marcus asked hoarsely, trying to make sense of the situation. "Where am I?" "Safe for now," the stranger replied cryptically, crossing the room to a desk. "We got you out of there just in time. You're lucky. Another few minutes, and you would have been gone." Marcus tried to sit up more fully, but was stopped by a sharp pain in his chest. He winced, but managed to keep his composure. "You saved me. But why? Who are you working for?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. They walked over to a small table and retrieved a bottle of water, offering it to Marcus. He took it gratefully, drinking in small sips, trying to steady his breathing. "You're not the only one who's been targeted," the figure finally said, their voice low. "But I'm guessing you already knew that." Marcus's heart raced at their words. "Who are they? Why are they after us?" "After me?" The stranger didn't answer right away, and for a long moment, there was only silence between them. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of a generator in the corner, a reminder that this wasn't a safe house. This was a temporary refuge. "You've got enemies, Director," the stranger said finally, their voice calm but serious. "Big ones. And they're not going to stop until they have you. Or until they have everything you know." Marcus tried to process the words, but they didn't make sense. "I don't understand." "Whoever is behind this has access to high-level information. People who know how to disappear, how to cover their tracks," the figure continued. "And right now, you're caught in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. Your life, your career, they're just the tip of the iceberg." Marcus's mind raced. Every word seemed to be another piece of the puzzle falling into place, but none of it made sense. "Why him? Why now? Who's behind all this?" he asked urgently. "I need answers. My team. Where's Rachel? Where's Davis?" The figure's expression tightened, and their eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting someone to come through at any moment. "Your team's safe, for now, but they'll be coming for them too. We can't stay here long." Marcus's heart sank. "We need to move then." The stranger paused, as if weighing the decision, and then nodded. "We've got one more stop, and after that, we find out who's behind all this, and we end it." The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus slowly stood, his body still protesting with every movement. His chest felt tight, the bandages wrapped around him a temporary comfort. The stranger, who had been quiet up until now, seemed to be waiting for him to regain his strength, giving him just a moment before they both turned to leave the small, dimly lit room. Marcus steadied himself, taking a deep breath. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice firm but edged with curiosity. Whoever had saved him had to know more than they were letting on. But it was clear that this person wasn't interested in sharing details. The stranger glanced at him, their expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in their eyes, perhaps regret or wariness. "You're not in a position to ask too many questions yet," they said. "But if you must know, I work for a group of people who think it's time someone took control of the situation. The ones behind this, they've been operating in the shadows for too long." Marcus frowned. "You're talking about whoever's been hunting me, right? Who exactly is taking control here?" The stranger didn't respond immediately, moving toward the door. "We'll talk more when we're not sitting ducks," they said, their voice cold, distant. "Right now, we need to keep moving." It wasn't a reassurance, but it was clear the stranger wasn't giving him any more answers, at least not yet. Still, Marcus had no choice but to follow. There were too many unknowns at play, and as much as it bothered him not to have all the pieces, he didn't have the luxury of time. With the stranger in the lead, they moved down the narrow corridor of what appeared to be an abandoned building, dim lights flickering overhead and the floor creaking underfoot with every step. Marcus couldn't help but wonder where exactly he was. If they were running from their enemies, why had they come here? And what kind of people had the resources to pull off such a massive operation? They emerged into another empty hallway, this one darker than the last. The stranger's movements were swift, like they knew exactly where they were going. Marcus tried to match their pace, but his body still felt sluggish, like his limbs were made of lead. "Where are we going?" he asked again, trying to get some more information. "Somewhere safe," the stranger replied. "But not for long. We're just trying to get ahead of them. Right now, we need to know exactly who's hunting you and why. We have a few pieces of the puzzle, but we're still missing a lot." Marcus felt his frustration building. "I don't need to know why. I need to know how to stop them." The strangers stopped in their tracks, turning to face him. There was a moment of silence before they spoke again, their voice colder than before. "You think you're in control of this, don't you? You think you're going to stop them. But Marcus, you have no idea who you're dealing with." The words stung, and Marcus clenched his jaw, but the stranger continued, their gaze unwavering. "Whoever's behind this is smarter than you. They've planned for every contingency. They've been watching you, tracking your every move. And you're not the only one they're targeting. This isn't just about you. It's about a much bigger agenda, one that's been in the making for years." Marcus felt a chill wash over him. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, but they didn't make him feel any better. He had known for a while that he was a target, but hearing it in such stark terms made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. "And what does this bigger agenda have to do with me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The stranger didn't immediately respond. Instead, they stepped forward and reached into their jacket pocket, pulling out a small device that Marcus couldn't quite recognize. They glanced at it briefly before handing it to Marcus. "Take a look," the stranger said, their voice barely a whisper. Marcus took the device, squinting at the screen. It was a handheld tablet of some kind, and the screen displayed several files, documents, pictures, and maps. He scrolled through them quickly, but one name stood out. FBI, Special Cases Division. There was a file marked with his own name, but it was the next one that caught his attention. Project Phoenix. What the hell is this? Marcus muttered under his breath, confusion taking hold of him. Project Phoenix was an operation that was supposed to be classified, but someone leaked it to the wrong people, the stranger said, their tone darker now. It was meant to monitor and protect high-risk individuals, people like you. But somehow, it got twisted. Someone decided to use it as a way to control certain outcomes. And you, Marcus, are right in the middle of it. Marcus's blood ran cold as the implications began to set in. Wait a minute. This was about me? This whole thing. It's been about me all along? Not just you, the stranger replied. It's bigger than that. They've been manipulating people, controlling situations. And now they want to make sure you're on their side, or gone. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to absorb the truth of what he was hearing. The FBI? Special cases? Project Phoenix? It didn't make sense, but it was clear that whatever had been happening was far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. And how do you fit into this? Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing on the stranger. The stranger's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see this through. But right now, we both have a common enemy. Marcus didn't have time to process that last comment. From the corner of his eye, he saw a faint movement in the hallway. Someone was coming. Get down, the stranger hissed, pulling Marcus into the nearest room and slamming the door behind them. They both pressed their backs against the wall, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. Through the cracks of the door, Marcus could see several figures moving down the hallway. They were dressed in tactical gear, their footsteps heavy, their presence unmistakable. They're closing in, the stranger muttered, eyes sharp. You're going to have to decide, Marcus. Do you want to fight them now, or do we keep running? Marcus gritted his teeth, staring at the figures approaching. This was his moment to make a choice, fight or flight. But even as the thought crossed his mind, another realization set in. No matter what he chose, the enemy would never stop coming for him. He looked at the stranger, determination in his eyes. We fight. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus could feel his heart thudding in his chest, his breath shallow. The enemy was closing in fast. They had no idea what they were walking into, but Marcus knew they'd soon learn. The stranger next to him was already moving, positioning themselves by the door, their gun at the ready. Stay low, they whispered, their voice steady. We'll make our stand here. When they come in, we take them by surprise. Marcus nodded. His chest still hurt from the bullet wound, but the pain was a distant thought now. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins, sharpening his senses. He was used to being in dangerous situations, but this felt different. This wasn't just another routine mission. This was a fight for survival, one that would determine everything. They both crouched low, the air thick with tension. Marcus could feel the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. If they fought, they were risking everything. But if they ran, they were only delaying the inevitable. A loud bang came from the other side of the door. Someone was trying to break it down. The countdown had begun. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his gun. He was ready. They were going to give the enemy a fight they'd never forget. Another bang. The door was starting to splinter. On my signal, the stranger whispered, their voice calm but filled with purpose. We hit them hard. Don't hold back. Marcus gave a small nod, his eyes fixed on the door. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, but then the door gave way with a loud crash, splintering completely. The enemy had entered. 3 men rushed into the room, their guns raised, ready for whatever waited inside. They barely had time to react before Marcus and the stranger fired in unison. The first man crumpled to the floor with a grunt, his rifle falling from his hands. The second man fired wildly, but Marcus was faster. He ducked behind a crate for cover and fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. The third enemy soldier hesitated, eyes wide with surprise at the precision of their attackers. Marcus didn't give him the chance to recover. With a swift movement, he pushed off from the crate and sprinted toward the third man, taking him down with a quick shot to the leg, knocking him off balance. The soldier fell, his weapon skidding across the floor. In mere seconds, the 3 men were incapacitated, sprawled out in various positions on the floor. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow, his breathing heavy but controlled. Nice work, the stranger said, standing up from their crouch, keeping their gun raised in case anyone else was coming. But this won't hold them off for long. Marcus was already scanning the room, his eyes darting to every corner, every exit. They needed a plan, something that could buy them enough time to regroup. I don't like the way this is going, he muttered. We need to know who's behind all this. They're not just hunting me. They're hunting all of us. The stranger moved closer, her face hardening. I agree. And that's why we need to hit them where it hurts. It's time to find their headquarters and shut it down before they can do any more damage. Before Marcus could respond, another sound pierced the air, a faint noise like the humming of an engine. "What's that?" Marcus asked, instinctively moving to the window to peer outside. His hand paused mid-motion, his mind racing. Through the small gap between the blinds, he could just make out the shape of a helicopter hovering above the building. "No way," he whispered. "They brought in air support. This just got a whole lot worse." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "We need to move. Now. If they've got eyes in the sky, they'll track us the second we step outside. We'll be sitting ducks." Marcus turned toward the door they had entered through and then looked at the window once more, the helicopter's spinning blades casting a shadow on the ground below. He didn't have much time to think. "You're right," he said. "We can't stay here. They'll find us the second we're exposed." The stranger grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the window. "Follow me. I have a way out." Without hesitation, they moved quickly, stepping over the incapacitated soldiers. The stranger led him down a narrow hallway that seemed to open into a maze of utility rooms. Every step felt heavier than the last. Marcus's thoughts were racing. Who was behind all of this? Why him? What was Project Phoenix really about? And how had it all spiraled out of control so quickly? They reached a dead-end door, but the stranger had already unlocked it with a quiet click. Behind it was a staircase that led down into darkness. "Is this it?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Are you sure this leads to safety?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. They only glanced at him with a brief, almost unreadable look before they began descending the stairs. "I don't trust anyone else to get us out of this alive. So, unless you've got a better idea." Marcus fell into step behind them, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the stairwell. The air grew colder the further they went, and the dim light above them flickered intermittently. They reached the bottom of the staircase, and the stranger stopped in front of another door, this one heavy and reinforced. "This leads to the underground tunnels," the stranger said, turning to face Marcus. "We can use these to get out of the building undetected." Marcus glanced at the door, then back at the stranger, his mind still racing. "Underground tunnels? Why didn't you tell me about these earlier?" The stranger gave him a hard look, almost amused. "Because I didn't want you to know how deep this goes. You wouldn't believe me." Marcus didn't say anything. He knew better than to press further. They had no time for questions, only action. They opened the door to reveal a small, dimly lit corridor that stretched out in front of them. The walls were concrete, cracked in some places, and the floor was uneven, as if it had been long since forgotten. "We move fast. We're not alone down here," the stranger said. "Stay alert." They began walking quickly through the narrow passage, the walls seeming to close in around them. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But he knew one thing for sure. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The corridor twisted and turned, but the further they went, the more certain Marcus became that they weren't going to get out of here without another fight. He was right. As they rounded the corner, they were met with the unmistakable sound of boots marching in unison. The footsteps were getting louder, closer, and Marcus knew exactly what that meant. The enemy was already here. The sound of boots echoed through the narrow tunnel, getting closer with each passing second. Marcus and the stranger froze, pressing their backs against the cold concrete walls. The darkness seemed to close in around them, but they couldn't afford to make a sound. Every step was a potential death sentence. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. They were running out of time. The enemy was closing in, and they had nowhere to hide. The stranger's eyes flicked toward Marcus, their expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in their gaze, determination, maybe even a hint of regret. "We need to keep moving," the stranger whispered, barely audible over the sound of approaching footsteps. "There's a way out, but we have to reach it before they find us." Marcus nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. He was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of his fate, about ending this twisted game. They continued to move through the tunnel, their steps slow and calculated. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, felt like a threat waiting to pounce. But they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving forward. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The silence was deafening. He motioned for the stranger to stop, and they both crouched down, straining to hear any movement from the enemy. But there was nothing. The tunnel was eerily still. "What happened?" Marcus whispered, his voice tight with tension. The stranger's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't know. They've stopped. But we can't wait around to find out why." Just as they were about to move again, a voice rang out from the darkness ahead of them. Marcus Johnson. The voice was calm, almost taunting. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was the same man who had confronted him in the courtroom, the one who had been behind everything from the beginning. The stranger's eyes widened in recognition, and they moved closer to Marcus, whispering urgently, "It's him. The one running the show. We need to end this now." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had come too far to back down now. The truth was within reach, and this man was the key to it all. The only way to stop this was to confront him, to put an end to everything. He stepped forward, his gun raised, ready for whatever was coming. From the shadows, the man in the dark suit stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. He was flanked by several heavily armed soldiers, their weapons trained on Marcus and the stranger. "You think you've won," the man said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You think you're in control now? You're just a pawn in a game far bigger than you. All this time, you've been walking right into my trap." Marcus's grip tightened on his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I'm not your pawn anymore, and I'm not walking into anything. This ends now." The man chuckled. "You're brave, Marcus, but you're outmatched. You always have been." Before Marcus could react, the man gestured, and the soldiers moved forward, surrounding them. The stranger reached for their own weapon, but the soldiers were too quick, their guns trained on both Marcus and the stranger. Marcus's mind raced. This was it, the final confrontation, the moment where everything would either come crashing down or finally be set right. "Do you really think you can stop us?" the man continued, his smile widening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't just about you or the FBI. This is bigger. This is about control, about shaping the future. And you were always part of the plan." Marcus felt a coldness settle in his stomach. It wasn't just about him. It was about something else, something far more sinister. He had been a part of this twisted plot from the beginning, whether he had known it or not. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the danger. "I don't know everything, but what I do know is that you're not going to get away with this." The man's smile faltered, just for a moment. It was enough for Marcus to make his move. In one swift motion, he turned and lunged toward the stranger, using their body as a shield. The soldiers hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the sudden action. Marcus fired twice, the sound of the gunshots echoing through the tunnel. One soldier dropped, the other staggered back, and for a brief moment, chaos erupted. The stranger moved quickly, taking down another soldier with a well-placed shot. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved with them, firing at the remaining soldiers, his heart racing as the fight continued. But it wasn't over yet. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't backing down. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You can't win. You're outnumbered. And you've already lost." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't going to let this man dictate the outcome. He had come too far to give up now. The battle raged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Marcus saw his opening. The man in the dark suit was distracted, his attention on the remaining soldiers. It was the perfect moment. Marcus lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The man struggled beneath him, but Marcus's grip was ironclad. With one final, swift movement, he disarmed the man, pinning him to the cold concrete floor. "Tell me who's behind all of this," Marcus demanded, his voice filled with fury. "Tell me everything." The man looked up at him, his smile now gone. "You're too late," he hissed, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll never stop us. No one can." Marcus pressed harder on his chest, his anger surging. "Tell me." The man's eyes flicked to the side, a fleeting glance that made Marcus's blood run cold. And then, with one final laugh, the man's body went limp. Marcus pulled back, realizing too late that the man had been wearing a suicide vest. The explosion rocked the tunnel, sending a wave of heat and debris into the air. The last thing Marcus remembered before everything went black was the sound of the tunnel collapsing and the feeling of his world crumbling around him.